Good evening. Hello. Hi, guys. How's it going? Okay, I'm just going to let Kylie in. This is fun.
Hi.
Hi. Hello. Good evening.
Got
How are you?
dressed up. I feel underdressed.
Oh, it's like a formal event of lockdown.
I didn't get the memo.
Sorry. Oh, cool. Okay, well, we'll just wait maybe 30 seconds or so for people to join us. But thank you so much for doing this with me. I've never done anything like this before, so it's all new to me. But yeah, this is Kylie, everybody. She is amazing. She is like an absolute wizard when it comes to everything to do with the body and the mind. Hence why I always call her Dr. Kylie. So yeah, she has very kindly offered to jump on here and talk to us a little bit about pain and injury and breath. Yeah, so I guess what sparked doing this is my own experience with injuries and healing and all the different strategies that there are available to heal the body, basically, and what works and what doesn't work. And yeah, I just feel like there's probably a whole lot of people out there with different injuries going on, and I feel like a lot of what you know will be really, really helpful and beneficial for people to hear and apply.
Awesome.
Yeah. So,
Great. So do you want to start by telling us about your injury then?
right. Okay. So my injury, guys, believe it or not. So I thought yoga teacher, I do heaps of yoga. I go to the gym. I do lots of heavyweight stuff. I thought I'm never going to get an injury. I'm sorted. Yeah. I stretch, I work out. And it turns out that I have a lot of pain in my lower back, which I know is really common. And long story short, it's actually a bit of a bulging disc. So I feel a lot of pain here. And it turns out that I have very weak glutes and not much core strength after obviously going through a pregnancy and giving birth as well. So yeah, that is what kind of sparked this off for me. And I wanted to ask you, what is pain and how does it work?
Yeah, cool. So pain's an interesting thing because it's not actually, it doesn't indicate tissue damage exactly. So we have all of these receptors within our body, and some of them in particular are called nociceptors, and they are basically there to tell us, or tell the brain rather, when there is perhaps potential for injury. And so they will signal to the brain, and then what happens is it fires off in the brain and you get all of these different areas of the brain light up. And that's called a neuromatrix of pain, basically. And then depending on whether you've had that injury before, where you are when you are experiencing this stimuli, wherever it might be, your all of the social factors, everything is taken into account as to whether you will feel pain. So pain is actually an output from your brain, and it doesn't necessarily indicate how much tissue damage there is there. And that is why people can have, say, an injury where they do have pain, but then maybe a year later are still experiencing pain, but the tissue damage is no longer there. Because the tissue damage, usually within sort of 3 to 6 months, the tissues will heal. But what happens is we get the nervous system becomes highly sensitized. And so people who suffer from chronic pain, and in particular chronic low back pain, what has happened there is your nociceptors and your nervous system has become on high alert. So you get the sensation or the feeling, the output of of pain from the brain without the actual tissue damage there. So that is why pain can be really complex, but also really interesting.
Because quite often I think when we have pain in the area, we think that the problem is that area. But more often than not, it's coming from somewhere else. right? So
Exactly.
I guess,
Exactly.
I mean, the difference between a cumulative injury, so something that's built up over time, and something that is an impact injury would be different though, right?
Yeah. So an impact injury would be, say, if you had a motor vehicle accident, or you fell off your bike, or had a snowboarding accident. That would be a sudden impact injury that would be causing tissue damage and pain. A lot of what people experience, though, particularly when it comes to backs and shoulders and necks, is an accumulative thing. So it's how they've been moving their body over time. And so what happens in the body is anywhere that you don't move so well, other areas are going to take up that load and do the work for you. And what happens then is we end up kind of overloading certain areas. So for instance, with you and your back pain and baby, etc. So probably what was happening is there was a lack of stability through your low back. And so other areas were picking up the load to try and stabilize you. And I remember when you came and we did the biomechanics module, you were obsessed with stretching this area out. And that's often what we do when we have pain or tension. Tightness is another output from the brain. So it's a message from the brain or the nervous system that something needs to change and adapt. So pain and tightness in particular, is usually the nervous system saying, hey, you don't have the strength and stability to be going into this range or to be in this place. I'm going to put the brakes on. So when I saw you back in, I think February, was it? And you were stretching a lot through this area. So tell me about that, and how did that go?
I feel like I've been doing since then a lot more work on stability, and it's quite interesting because the moment I do my stability work, so transverse abs, deep abs, and external rotators in the hips and the glutes, immediately after I do that, the pain is gone. But you have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
But I've definitely slowed down on the stretching and added more stability work into my own practice, my own exercise, as well as my teaching as well, because now I realize that that is what is missing, right?
It's totally what's missing.
It's what everyone's missing in their yoga practice, in their workouts, training, everyday life. We don't practice stability.
No. We kind of overemphasize, particularly in yoga, there has been an overemphasis on the flexibility side of things. And flexibility is different to mobility. And just like stability is different to rigidity. So we want to have a body and joints that are stable and mobile, meaning I own my range of motion. I can control my range of motion. And often what happens in yoga, because people who are attracted to yoga tend to be the more flexible, they tend to like to go into the stretches, which is probably not really what their body needs. It's more the strength and stability work to contain and control their range of motion.
Yeah, right.
And my big thing is at the moment, stop stretching what is tight, because the tightness is telling you there's an inherent lack of stability and strength somewhere.
Yeah. Wow. Mind blowing, right? So what is the difference between going to the gym and lifting heavy weights and getting strong and working out those kind of global muscles versus being stable within the joint?
Yeah, great question. So we have obviously global muscles, so they tend to be the ones that are more superficial. So biceps, quadriceps, the ones that people are familiar with. And then we have the deeper in muscles, or what we call the intrinsic muscles. And these are the muscles that are really important for stabilization. And these are the muscles that often get inhibited when we spend too much time on the external and, building our biceps and quadriceps and all of these bigger muscles that are easier to feel the sensation, that I'm working. To get into these these deeper muscles, it takes a much more mind-body connection, and the movements are much smaller, so they're often not as exciting to do. It doesn't look as flash at the gym, but it is functionally better for you in the long term.
Carry on. Oh, have you
No.
You're there.
So
I was going to say, in terms of injury, what is a common thing that happens to people mentally when you you have an injury and you start going into this not victim mode, but like you start, the stories start going in the brain, and you start thinking, well, what do I meant to do? Do I rest it? You know, I can't do this now, I can't do that now. And you end up almost sort of limiting, or at least slowing down your recovery and your healing because of what's going on up here. So how does that feel?
So true. And it's interesting because up until, you know, fairly recently, that was the kind of what you did. You had an injury, you know, did the rest, ice, compression, elevation, and you rested it for a few days. But now what they realize is that, you know, the movement is actually really beneficial for moving the inflammation out of the area. So for lymphatic drainage, for keeping the fascia hydrated so that you don't end up then having the fascia getting all sticky and stuck, so then it immobilizes the area even more. So it's actually better to continue to load within what is comfortable for you, and to progressively load. So obviously if you've just broken your arm and the bone is sticking out, you're not going to load it. As soon as you can start to bring some sort of movement and load, then you want to be doing that. If it is just like a kind of a sprain or something like that, just gentle mobilization so that it will start to, you know, move the inflammation out of the area. Load is the language of cells. So when we load cells, they get stronger, they grow. And so that's what we want to be doing, is loading, but in a progressive way, and not to the point where it is creating more pain. So you're staying within what is comfortable for you in that moment. So with your back pain, so with your low back pain, in the past, like a few years ago, it was basically, you know, you lay down, you don't do anything. Now with back pain, they get you walking and doing as much as you can within the range of being comfortable and not in pain. So with your pain, what did they get you doing straight off the bat?
So yeah, straight away it was working on the outside hip, the outside glute, and the deep ab muscles. So obviously we have the two layers of abs. We have the top layer, which you can see, the cheese grater, you know, the pretty abs that you see when you go to the gym, and then you have the strong ones underneath that stabilize us. And those were the ones for me that were completely not ruined, but you know, damaged after having baby. And then that paired with the compression of carrying her on one side over time had obviously started to cause that pain sensation. But yeah, so I'm just doing loads of deep core work and loads of glute stabilization and outer hip stuff, really. And I do that every single day. And as soon as I've done it, I feel heaps better.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting about the deep core and stability is it's also related to your breath. So if your breath isn't going three-dimensionally into your rib cage, and by that I mean actually into this back rib space, then you're not able to create the conditions for intra-abdominal pressure, which then allows you to create a really strong, stable core for your lumbar spine. So many of us are breathing up here in this kind of upper chest area, not really using the diaphragm so well, using more of our accessory muscles, which is also problematic for core stabilization. It also is another thing that will signal to the nervous system that I'm not safe. And the nervous system will go into those reflexive guarding patterns, creating tension within the body. So yeah, a big thing for you is to also keep working on the three-dimensional breath that we worked on in February.
Yeah.
And seeing if you can couple that, keep the three-dimensional breath as you activate your transverse ab,
which is
layer.
Really hard. Yeah, to pair the two together, it's so challenging. I was going to ask you how the breath tied into all that. So that kind of sparks another question with core stability, and how we're always taught to squeeze the belly in, suck the belly in, Uddiyana Bandha, and we've totally moved away from that now, right?
Yeah. So pulling the belly in is actually the opposite of core stabilization. So if you were to lift something heavy up off the floor, like a unicorn stool, your body would naturally actually do an expansion out. So
Yeah.
if you were to kind of have your fingers on the sides and imagine that you're going to kind of give yourself a punch, notice what you do to resist that. It's actually an expansion out. Same too, when you lift up something heavy, you don't squeeze your belly in to lift it up. You create that expansion through the belly, you stabilize, and then you lift up. And what's been happening, particularly in the yoga realm for some time, is this whole obsession with pulling the belly in, and pulling the belly in when you're, you know, in crescent warrior or things like that, where you don't need to be pulling the belly in, because what it's doing is disrupting your natural breathing mechanics. So in your breathing mechanics, the diaphragm wants to move down, the pelvic floor wants to move down as I breathe in, and then they come back up as I breathe out. If I am pulling the belly in, that pulls the pelvic floor up. So now my diaphragm can't actually move down where it needs to go. So I'm going to force more of my accessory muscles to have to work. If I keep pulling the pelvic floor up like that and pulling the belly in, it's also going to lead to pelvic floor issues and, again, low back issues, because there's that lack of stability around that area again.
Wow, man, this is amazing. So, like, where would we start? Where would people start with all this kind of stuff? If people are listening and watching and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't do any stability, I don't do any breath work. Yeah, how does this relate to people? How can they start to introduce some of this stuff?
Yeah, breath is I guess the key thing to start with. So just, you know, tying something around your ribs, or placing one hand onto the back and one hand onto the front, so that you can actually feel the expansion in both directions. That would be the first place, because if you don't have that, it's very hard to then fit everything else in. So allowing the ribs to expand three-dimensionally, the belly to just be soft and be moving with the breath, and the pelvic floor to be lifting and lowering with the diaphragm. That would be phase one. Once you can do that, then you can play around with, you know, if you're lying down on your tummy, on your back rather, you can bring your hands just above your pubic bone and try and expand out into your fingertips. So it's that feeling of like coughing or laughing, which will create the expansion. Seeing if you can maintain that as you breathe into all sides of your rib cage again. And then you can do the same with the hands on the outside, the same feeling of trying to resist a punch as you breathe three-dimensionally into all sides. Once you can do that, then you can start to layer on things like lifting one leg up and down, lifting two legs up and down, you know, one at a time. And then you can move it into things like quadruped, the classic kind of bird dog scenarios. You can put a block on your back so that you can feel if the lumbar spine is starting to move. So you want to like progressively load it. You don't want to go to the most complicated, heaviest loaded exercise right off the bat, because what you're looking for is when you lose the breath. So as soon as you start to do anything funky with your breath, like hold it or grip in your neck or anything like that, then you want to go back to a previous stage and build that foundation. Because remember, these deeper muscles, smaller is better, and then we can load over time.
Yeah, so that kind of brings me to that point of, if you can't breathe there, then you shouldn't be there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't, you don't own the position if you can't breathe in it.
For sure, for sure. So it's about being able to brace through the core to stabilize the spine, and then bring the breath in, especially into that back body. I'm right in thinking that most of our lung tissue and a lot of our diaphragm sits right into that back body space too, right?
Somebody taught you well.
Wow. I wonder who that might be. Yeah, and I always teach this in my classes about really breathing into that back space, and it's so hard to access because we're not used to it. There's no mind to muscle connection into that space. But it's quite interesting how when you start to get it, it is really naturally calming to breathe into that space.
So calming, because now you're actually giving your body the oxygen, you know, that it needs, and using the body in the way it was supposed to be used, rather than creating all this unnecessary
Yes.
tension in your neck and shoulders. Yeah.
Another question I had was to do with the reflexive guarding, actually. And you know how we kind of tend to think that we might be tight or inflexible, or we can't move this or we can't move that, we're lacking mobility. But what happens when something is weak, or when we're not breathing properly and we're not bracing properly, then we start to, like that video that you put up of that guy where he was trying to lift his leg.
Yes.
It wasn't until you got him breathing and bracing properly, then he had way more range of motion.
Yeah.
How does that work with? Yeah.
Sorry. Carry on.
No,
How does it work?
okay. How does it work with the idea of reflexive guarding? Like, what is that?
Yeah. So reflexive guarding is basically the nervous system putting the brakes on. So when the nervous system is basically king for our movement. If it feels that you don't have strength or stability, it is going to put the brakes on. And so often people feel like they have tight shoulders, or they have tight hips, or tight hamstrings was the case in that video, or tight hip flexors. The problem isn't so much that they are tight. The problem is that there is a lack of stability around this area, and probably a lack of that three-dimensional breath as well, to be able to create the stability. And so what happens is the nervous system goes, I need to put on the brakes. So it tightens, the hip flexors in order to stabilize the lumbar spine, tightens the hamstrings in order to stabilize the pelvis. So it's all about the mind basically going, we need to stop. You need to build some strength and stability before I'm going to give you range of motion.
Yeah.
And so
like
in that video,
mechanism.
Yeah. In that video, that particular gentleman had, obviously really tight hamstrings. One side he was experiencing a little bit of sciatic pain as well. And he couldn't actually mobilize that leg so well. And when we did that little test where I got him on the ground, got him breathing, got him to engage his core, and then his leg went to 90. So the problem isn't that he lacks range of motion in his hamstrings. The problem is he lacks stability in his core, and so his nervous system is going, no way am I going to let you have that range of motion. Yeah.
So that comes back to, if the nervous system feels safe, and it feels safe by giving it stability, it will grant you that range of motion. It will grant you the flexibility.
Yeah.
But until that happens, jamming yourself into an extreme range of motion is not helpful at all.
No. And that's where, the strength and stability based practices and implementing that more into the yoga practice can be really beneficial. By helping people to gain more mobility and more control over their range of motion.
Although it's not always what people want, right?
Well, no, because it's not fancy.
Yeah. And it's hard.
It makes your butt burn.
Yeah. I just wanted to, I don't know if anyone that's listening has any questions right now, but if you guys do have any questions, please fire them through just while Kylie and I are talking, and we can do our best to answer them. Or if anyone watches this later and has any questions, they can also ask us as well. But was anything else that you wanted to add? Question.
Oh, is that a question coming through, or just?
Yeah. Or like,
I'm paused waiting for the question, but it's not coming.
Okay, carry on while she types the question.
So I was going to say, so the movements that you've been given from the physio, are they a mix of isometric, meaning the muscle doesn't lengthen, or are they concentric, eccentric, meaning shortening and lengthening? Or is it a mix?
They are all dynamic, so they're all lengthening and shortening, eccentrically, concentrically. Because it's all like it's basically just dead bugs, abduction of the hip, those clamshell movements, and then I just add a band on slowly. So I progressively load up by putting the band on to add more resistance.
Nice.
But it's all really small movements, and that's the part that gets people. Like when you do a bridge, we're so used to like arching through the back and like just opening up and blah blah blah, which is lovely, but that is not using your glutes, that is using your back. So it's funny because you really have to dial it down, and the movements are a lot smaller when you're isolating just that one muscle group, rather than, like you said before, recruiting other parts of the body to do the movement for you so that you can get deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, sorry, back to concentric, eccentric.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, because the other interesting thing with the body, so if you are experiencing pain, or you want to work on mobility or getting more range of motion, the thing to start with is isometric work. So isometric meaning the muscle belly isn't shortening or lengthening, and I'm just holding. So for instance, if I was to push against my hand, so I'm pushing out with my knee and in with my hand, I'm holding an isometric contraction through my lateral hip and abductors. So that isometric contraction helps to bring more of the motor units online. So when we then go into more dynamic movement that involves the shortening and the lengthening of the muscle, we have more of the motor units available. So the muscle is a little stronger. The other good thing about isometrics, if you are experiencing pain, for instance, like SI joint pain, isometric work into like piriformis and lateral hips can be really beneficial because it has an analgesic effect as well. So the body puts out its own analgesia or pain relief, as well as you're strengthening those muscles that are there to support the SI joint. So if you're having SI joint pain, don't go and stretch or sit in a long held pigeon pose, because it's just going to make it worse. You want to do some strength and stability stuff and probably some isometric work.
Yeah. So that in layman's terms, I suppose, that would be what we call, when I teach anyway, I call that kind of activating the muscle. So bringing that mind to muscle connection and starting to wake up the muscle, fire the muscle, so that when you go to use it later on, it's there and you can recruit the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay, the question. So Penny has asked, I'm curious how hypermobility fits into this. Obviously, stability will help prevent injury from hypermobility, but do you use the same techniques? How can you tell the difference between injury pain and like that nice post-workout pain?
Yeah, so there's a few questions in there. First of all, hypermobility. Yeah. So, no.
Oh, hang on. I'll pin it.
Okay, there we go. So first of all, hypermobility, it depends on what you mean by that, because there is a clinical condition called hypermobility, which includes things like your blood vessels being, more mobile. There's a range of other symptoms that come under hypermobility. Or are you talking about the person who has the, above the elbow joint, like M's, that goes past, the 180 degrees. So what M has got there is just a joint that is hypermobile, but not necessarily hypermobility, because hypermobility is something that you actually have to go to a doctor and have a genetic test to say that you have it, because there's a whole lot of other symptoms that come into hypermobility. Anxiety is actually one of them as well. Yeah. So this kind of thing, like what M's got, where the joint goes past its, what would be normal, and I use inverted commas because it is normal to have a joint that goes past that, because all joints are different. So if your joints do that, what you want to be able to do is strengthen through the full range. So oftentimes what happens is people get told to just micro bend the elbows, but that's not how their elbows are. So if they then fall on that elbow and it goes into that 180 degree place or further, they don't have the strength and stability to control that. So it's about actually muscular action around the joint, not just working with a micro bend, because that's not realistic in terms of how your elbows are day to day. Does that make sense?
So it's about building strength and stability across your whole range of motion, whatever that might be.
Exactly.
So she said, my problem isn't too much range of motion, my problem is too much range of motion, which sort of tricks you into thinking there's stability there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, just because you've got range of motion doesn't mean that it is stability. So for instance, this, if I hold my leg up here, here's my range of motion, but can I keep it there? No, there's my actual active mobility. So just because you can get into those extreme ranges of motion doesn't mean that you own that position. So what's really useful to do is, if you are going into those places, go, okay, can I do this without the use of my body? Can I do this without holding my leg? Can I do it without using a strap? What's that? To clarify. What was the other part of the question? I'm just...
That was the first part. The problem is too much range of motion, which tricks her into thinking that there's stability there.
Right.
Because your brain thinks, I can get there, so, you know, I'm fine there, I can live there.
Yeah. And that's common with a lot of yogis, because yogis tend to be more flexible. We tend to be able to get into these positions without, you know, too much effort. The problem is that we don't actually own the position. We're actually just going into our flexibility, not into the stability of that joint. So whatever position you're going to, you want to see if you can maintain it there without the use of props, the floor, all of that.
So apparently she said that she has a super hypermobile SI joint.
Super hypermobile.
Super hypermobile. Oh, no, I have a hypermobile SI joint.
Yeah.
But so noticed the other day, noticed doing a floor the other day, there was a lot less of something. I don't know.
Yeah. So
Penny, can you clarify this question, please? Oh,
mobile
crazy hypermobility symptoms, but stuff that gave me a fright when I did it. Like I felt like my joints would pop out. Yeah, so that's that feeling of not being stable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing about like hypermobility, if it is the clinical hypermobility, is it means that there is less proprioceptive information coming to the brain from the joints. So proprioception is knowing and feeling where my body is in space. And we use proprioception to help us to balance, right? Now, if I'm going into a range of motion, it is my proprioception that tells me whether it's, you know, it's a good place to be or if I've gone too far. When, people with the hypermobility, they have less of that. So they can't really tell whether they've gone too far or not until maybe the next day when perhaps there's an injury that develops. And so the other part was something about injury and pain, wasn't it? The difference between injury pain and like the nice post-workout pain. Well, injury pain, so pain is, again, it's very subjective. You know, what I think is painful and what Em thinks is painful might be quite different, because everybody's pain tolerance is quite unique, and the way we respond to events is unique. So I would say if it's I guess like sharp shooting, can't walk on it, it's probably going to be more of an injury. And if there is swelling that develops and inflammation that develops, it's probably going to be an injury. If it's just more that kind of DOMS, the delayed muscle soreness, or a little bit of fatigue or that kind of thing, then it's probably just that you've worked the muscles, and that's okay.
Because I have quite a lot of people who will say after a yoga class, oh, it hurts here after the yoga class. And it's really hard to know whether that's, you know, it hurts because I've used it and I haven't activated that muscle before, or it hurts because, you know, you've actually pulled something. So
I usually say, what does the pain feel like? You know, does it feel like a burning pain or a sharp stabby pain, or does it feel like a muscle that's being worked, or a cramp sensation? Or get them, ask your students, you know, what it actually feels like, because the more that they can delve into what it feels like, the more they can create more proprioception and interoception about it, but also they might then change their relationship with pain.
Yeah.
Because pain is not necessarily a bad thing. Pain just, tells us that we might need to adapt our behavior. But pain can also be, kind of a pleasurable thing as well. So we kind of got to get out of this idea that pain is bad and we only want to feel good the whole time. It's like there's a continuum, and pain is there to tell us that maybe we need to adjust our behavior a little.
Yeah. And that comes back to the stories and the mental side of it. When you feel pain, some people automatically freak out and they think, oh my gosh, I've hurt myself, that's it, I can't do this and I can't do that, and you kind of go down this rabbit hole of just really limiting yourself, like I was saying before. I had another question.
Back pain is a classic one for that, because oftentimes when people get disc bulges like you, they back off completely. I know I did when I had my disc bulge. I backed off everything. I wouldn't do any flexion exercises at all, and then that leads to other problems later down the track. So it's about, like we were saying earlier, moving within a range that is comfortable for you and progressively loading the tissues as you are recovering from that injury. Because like with your disc bulge, so often people freak out about disc bulges, like, oh my God, my life is over. But you are leading a perfectly healthy life. You were still, teaching lots of classes, doing a lot of yoga, lifting weights, and you had a disc bulge. So I think that's the other thing. We need to kind of get away from the stories that as soon as I have an injury, that's it, my life is over. It's like, no, it's just a chance to, learn some new ways to stabilize and to mobilize, and then you end up getting stronger.
And that's why I wanted to come and have this conversation too, is because I'm an example of that, of like I have quite a lot of pain in my back a lot of the time, but I'm not stopping, and I'm determined to figure out what it is that I need to do to heal and to recover. But that's what I was going to ask you before. The other thing that we tend to freak out about when it happens, cramp.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain why that is not necessarily a bad thing either?
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, it depends on when it's happening, because if it's happening when you're sleeping at night, then that's obviously some other things going on, and it might be mineral, magnesium depletion, stuff like that. But if it is happening, say, in the yoga practice, a common one is when I squeeze my heel to my butt, I get a cramp in my hamstring, or like if I'm kicking up and then I do an active version of it, I get a cramp in my hamstring. So the cramp is just basically your nervous system and your muscles working out how much of that muscle needs to come online to do that particular action. Now the hamstring is a 2-joint muscle, so it does hip extension and it does knee flexion. Whenever I ask a muscle that has 2 actions to do both at the same time, it's going to be weaker than when I just get it to do one of those actions. Hamstrings for a lot of people are a place of weakness. So as soon as we ask it to do 2 of those things and then maybe hold it for a little bit longer than they're used to, cramp sets in. So it's not something to freak out about. It's just like, oh, look, I'm building some new strength. That's what I often say.
Oh, yay. This is great.
And one way to get around it, if it is happening a lot, is to do kind of some isometric work in the hamstring first before you do that. So then more of the motor units have come online, so that when you do that thing again, you've got more of the muscle available to you to use. So the cramp is less likely to happen.
So in summary, cramp could also be another signal that that area could need a bit more strength and stability, rather than being something to avoid because of cramping.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. My hamstrings were notorious for cramping. If you did the kind of slidey out exercise or anything like that, I would get massive cramp. And so I would be like, I don't want to do that. It hurts. But yeah, once I started to learn more and more about it, I was like, oh, actually, no, that's what my body needs, because it's not strong in those ranges. So yeah.
Isn't it
And
funny as
again,
well
it's a
how
good pain.
we, sorry?
And I said, and it's a good pain.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather than a tissue damage pain.
But isn't it funny how we tend to avoid, the things that feel like that, the things that feel difficult, the things that feel hard at the time or a little bit uncomfortable, like chair pose. We immediately shy away from those things. But
Yeah.
I suppose the last thing that I really wanted to talk about is how all this kind of ties into yoga classes. Well, I know that this is a style of yoga where we're starting to incorporate all this stuff into yoga classes and deliver all the stuff that a lot of people need into our classes, because you see quite a lot of people with the same problems over and over again, don't you, in a one-on-one environment?
Yeah, and so that's why a lot of my classes, my public classes, involve quite a bit of strength and mobility work, because that's what I was seeing over and over in one-to-one settings. It's like difficulty breathing, maintaining intra-abdominal pressure, which then means core stabilization is not happening. If core stabilization isn't happening, then I have tight hips, tight hamstrings, tight hip flexors, lack of mobility, maybe tension through my neck and shoulders, maybe a shoulder injury, maybe a foot injury as well. It all stems back to the breath and lack of stability.
Wow, that is just honestly so mind-blowing. I've heard you explain this to me before, but like even hearing you say it the second time around and the third time around, I'm just like, it's so simple, you know? I mean, it makes sense. Build from the center, build from the core, build from the foundation, and then start to add on. Don't jump straight to the hardest thing. Yeah. Because over time, right, that will bite you in the butt, basically.
Yeah, well, that's where the accumulative injuries develop.
Yeah.
Which, you know, for most of us that we end up with an injury, you and myself included, it's been that accumulative over time.
Yeah. Which I would say would be common for a lot of people. Those bad habits, those bad patterns that you're doing and things you're overlooking over time, and then all of a sudden that develops into pain, and then et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay. Do you have anything else you want to add?
So I think we've covered it all. I think we're I mean, the only thing I do want to add is I do have an online course that will be coming out next week around improving stability and mobility. So it'll be a lot of what we've just been talking about in terms of how you can create more stability so that you can increase your mobility. So if people want to sign up for that, they can sign up on my website, and I'll be sending out the link, and then obviously through social media as well. Cool. And then obviously they should go to your live stream classes, my live stream classes.
Absolutely, that is the answer to all your problems. Okay, cool. Does anyone have any questions